Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Welcome to today's show. We're going to start off firstly by discussing the EU Disinfolab disinformation campaign, I should say, on the part of India, which played out specifically in Europe as well as in other parts of the world. We're just going to mention this because the Pakistani Foreign Ministry has called for the international community to react to this, but it has not seemingly done so yet in, of course, a satisfactory fashion. Even EU Disinfolab's own representatives have said that had this been and had this involved other players, such as, for example, the Russians or the Chinese, the world may very well have reacted very differently. But now that it has to do with Indian disinformation campaign, there doesn't seem to have been that sort of reaction as one would have wanted and expected on the part of the international community. Now, the information is all out there, so it's not like I'm saying it or just the Pakistani government is saying it or somebody else is saying it who may have one-sided views. But in fact, this information is out there completely for everybody to read on EU Disinfolab's own website. You can search for Indian Chronicles, and all the information is there for you to read and see. Why hasn't this become a bigger issue? Why hasn't the international community reacted? Why hasn't there been more of an investigation done after this information was already released by EU Disinfolab? To its credit, of course, it has held to account the Indian government and the Indian state, as well as those Indian companies, of course, that were involved in such disinformation campaign against the Pakistani state. Regardless, as journalists and as media, it's important to note that we are in the business of trying to, of course, get transparent information out there, and that becomes ever tougher if we have this sort of disinformation and fake news coming out there, especially surrounding such sensitive issues on bilateral relations or just relations in a region which, of course, already suffers from its vast amounts of fake news altogether. Now I'll move on to today's first topic of the show, and that comes from Indonesia. We know that the U.S. government, as it has with other governments in Muslim countries as well as Arab countries, is pressuring other countries beyond the Bahrainis, the Emiratis, and the Moroccans to normalize ties with Israel. Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim country. Will it give in? Because what's now being dangling over its head is essentially seemingly a bribe of sorts, another $1 billion or so in development money, and that's certainly no small amount of change. Will Indonesia give in? What exactly is the Indonesian policy towards Palestine and Israel? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Wibawanto Widodo, who is Vice President of Operations of Democracy and Integrity for Peace Institute. He is joining us today from Jakarta. Also joining us from Jakarta is Bustanul Arifin, who is a lecturer in international relations at the President University. Bustanul and Wibawanto, thank you both for your time today. Wibawanto, I'd like to start with you. Just tell us the basics firstly, if you can, please. What is the Indonesian policy towards Palestine-Israel?
Okay, good afternoon from Jakarta. Thank you for the opportunity to invite me coming to this event. And this is a very important topic concerning the grand strategy of Indonesia, the global politics, and also about how Indonesia needs to do in order to advance its national interest at the global level. And then in order to see this perspective, including related to Indonesia's foreign policy, including also its relationship with the Middle East and also with Israel and with Palestinians. So we have to see this issue from the strategic perspective. We have to see it from the critical perspective, the historical perspective, synthetical thinking, systemic thinking, creative thinking, and also the futuristic thinking. So Indonesians, historically speaking, Indonesians' positions towards Palestinians issue is basically based on the solidarity because Indonesia wants to advance ideally speaking, every nations want to advance the global peace and then the equal rights among the nations, and then have the solidarity towards anybody, including Muslim brothers and also non-Muslim brothers. So Indonesia see it more as the issue that Indonesia can play the significant role in that particular case. So my perspective in this issue is in order for Indonesia to advance its national interests, whatever it is, including to help the cause of the Palestinian issues, Indonesia must have the equal access to three main stakeholders in the Middle East, with the Arabians, with the Arabics, with the Persians, and also with Jews. So it means that normalizing the ties with Israel, in my opinion, will help Indonesians' chance to that particular Palestinian cause. That's my point.
Okay, what are your thoughts on that? Because there's a lot of controversy here, certainly, about normalizing ties with Israel in such a situation, isn't there?
Correct. First thing I would like to say that Indonesian position on this issue, I think, is very clear. 2 days ago, our foreign minister said that Indonesian position on Israel and Palestine's issue will be very clear, that Indonesia will not build a relation with Israel if Israel doesn't allow Palestine to be free. And then I think this maneuver or this political strategy from US to provide like a fund for Indonesia if we build a good blood relation with Israel is not something interesting for Indonesian government. In my point of view, I think Indonesian government clearly will reject these points. However, the interesting thing that we can discuss is that how this economic opportunity can be used by a lot of economic sector in Indonesia. However, because we know that Indonesia is developing countries, we need a lot of money. However, a lot of condition right now is not good during this pandemic. And then this invitation, like some things are very clear for our some of communities, not all, some of our groups is sometimes they also positive with Israel issues. And then they will see this positive. However, this will be like a dilemma for Indonesian government, where Indonesian government see that we will not be able to build a relation because this will against our constitution. Because in Indonesian constitution, we will not accept colonializations, including the issue of Palestine as well. And then at one condition, our government right now is having very good relation with U.S. government as well. Maybe this something that is doing by U.S. government approaching the leader of Indonesia or something official from Indonesia. For example, a few weeks ago, we see like 2 ministers from Indonesia visit US, and then they met with Trump as well. And then maybe it is like a political dilemma for Indonesia as well. At one point, we need support from US as the biggest economy in the world. Right. However, at one condition, we see that this is very not good for our constitution as well to support colonization.
Wibawanto, as you mentioned, there's a moral issue here as well, right? Because all of the above, I would imagine that things would change if there were a proper resolution, which were just in the way of the Palestinian cause, right? I would imagine that would make it a lot easier for Indonesia, for example, to normalize ties with Israel. Will that be on the table? Because the other countries who have normalized ties with Israel, seemingly that hasn't even been part of the deal itself, actually.
Okay, so this is my point of view. Yeah, the first about the colonizations. So there are many interpretations pertaining to the relationship between Israel and Palestine issues. Okay, I've been studying on this topic for years. As my PhD in Arab and Islamic Studies, I'm focusing on the Middle East. So there are many dimensions to see the historical, the contextuality of the relationship between Israel and Palestine. Okay? That's why my starting point is we have to see it from the strategic thinking perspective. We have to see it through, not only from one shallow interpretations of what colonizations is. That's one thing. Okay? That's one thing. The second thing is, now we have to think about Indonesian national interest. What is the best course of actions to take for advancing Indonesian national interest in the future, right? It's about our national interest. The third, if we want to support Palestinians, or we want to be sympathized with any colonizations or any injustice or including to some perceptions about the Palestinians' cause, having normalized ties with the Israel, in my opinion, I can make a policy justification. It will increase the likelihood of Indonesians' ability and capacity to advance its national interest, including in helping Palestinians' cause. So we have to be critically, we have to think historically, we have to be synthetical, we have to be systemizing this issue from looking from many angles, and we have to be creative, and also we have to future-oriented thinking in order to see particular issues. So I challenge that position. So we have to be clear about this. So this is my point. Yeah, this is my point. From the theistic point of view, God has a unique purpose for every nation, like God has the unique purpose for every individual. Okay, so let Indonesia become the Indonesia that in theistic point of view, as God wants Indonesia to be. Let Israel be nation that God wants Israel to be, and let Palestine be the nations and or the state that God wants to be. So Indonesia has to play the wise role in this particular case. That's why Indonesia has to have the equal access to Arabics, to Jewish, and also to Persians. Three main stakeholders in the middle.
Okay, so let me come here from Bustanul. Certainly, as you know very well, the Palestinian Authority has not been happy. No Palestinian official or Palestinian has been happy about the normalization deals with Israel on the other countries' parts. Isn't it important then to speak to the Palestinians directly first, be it as Indonesians or other countries, and to see what their grievances are about why they are against this normalization?
I think we can see from some point of view regarding this issue. For example, like Mr. Wibawanto said before, like this is very good in term, maybe will be very good for our economics opportunity in the future. However, I think in the side of Indonesian governments, they will calculate the cost of politics, because this decision, if we build or rebuild the relations with Israel, and then this will bring a lot of political dynamics inside of Indonesia. This will bring a lot of domestic dynamic for a lot of Indonesian people. As we know that Indonesian people mostly they reject to build a relation with Israel, and then if the government decide to establish the relations with Israel, and then this will cause a lot of domestic politics for Indonesian leader, and then like we know that Indonesian leaders typically they will not take this risk to challenge their position in the government, because this will bring a lot of bad thing for them. This will not give a benefit for political leader in Indonesia, because they will lose a lot of voice from the people. Because at one point, like we see, if we talk about political domains, supporting Palestinian will be like political campaigns from Indonesian leaders for some of them to get voters from the people. Like we know that Indonesia is a Muslim majority country, and then most of the people will support the Palestine. And this will be very dilemma for Indonesia government, I think.
We'll have to leave that as a final word. Unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us. We appreciate both Wibawanto and Bustanul, Arifin, for speaking to us there, both of them speaking to us from the Indonesian capital, Jakarta, giving us their points of view about whether or not Indonesia will or should even, in fact, normalize ties with Israel, because the U.S. is essentially dangling an extra $1 billion or so of development money in the face of Indonesia, trying to, in my point of view at least, seemingly trying to bring it into the fore of these normalization of ties. As Bustanul there said at the end, there is the context, of course, of the Indonesian people themselves. It's the people on the streets and whether or not they are on board with this sort of decision, because it's significant in and of itself from many points of view for Indonesia as the world's largest Muslim country to be taking. On top of that, then there is the question of the Palestinians being against such normalizations of ties. So if we are saying that all the above countries that have normalized ties with Israel and may in the near future do so, if they claim that they're doing so for the Palestinians or to further the Palestinian cause, then maybe that needs to be communicated with the Palestinians. And why aren't the Palestinians getting that? There seems to be some breakdown of communication there and or no communication at all. And if this is all just being done for the sake of national interest, then these countries should come out and say so, that this is being done simply for national interests and not keeping in mind, for example, the quote-unquote Palestinian cause or the need for a just end to that entire issue altogether. That's very clear to then have transparency in that regard so that there is no confusion about what everyone's intentions are in this regard. I'll leave it there for now. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're going to discuss in this segment Blackwater and its guards, as well as its activities in Iraq. We remember back in 2007, there was a massacre at a square, the Nusur Square Massacre, as it's now known. It was a 2007 event in which 14 innocent Iraqis were killed by Blackwater guards who essentially reacted, or overreacted, I should say, to a situation where seemingly a car was coming towards them and was not stopping. A 9-year-old child was also shot in the head, and now President Donald Trump has, in fact, pardoned 4 of the men out of that incident who were convicted of manslaughter and various other charges as well. That has created uproar, and this is, of course, in a line of pardons, but this is significant, certainly from a foreign policy angle, about how, at least in the eyes of Iraqis then, the U.S. and the U.S. establishment were to then view the value of their lives, because many of the people at the receiving end then, of course, as well as the victims' families and other Iraqis, as per many media reports, are saying that this makes, again, them feel that their life is simply not worth as much as the U.S. may claim publicly that they are. Let's discuss that a bit further. When I joined by Dr. Karl Kaltenthaler, who is a professor of political science and director of security studies at the University of Akron. He's joining us now from Akron, Ohio. Karl, thank you very much for your time this morning. What do you make of this pardon? I mean, I know even in the U.S. there are a lot of concerns about this pardon.
Well, there's 2 things that could be at play here. The pardon could be because Donald Trump is trying to reward a very steadfast ally of his, Eric Prince, who owned Blackwater at the time of this incident. The other thing that could be going on here is that Trump could be trying to placate people within his base who have lobbied strongly for pardoning these 4 individuals. This was a very controversial case in the United States when it was tried. There were some loud voices on the right that said these people should not have been tried, that this was a war zone, that this was not the right thing to do to convict these people. So it's possible that Trump is really trying to kill 2 birds with 1 stone by doing this, making people in his base happy and at the same time rewarding a political ally.
I mean, it couldn't have come at a worse time, right? Because seemingly, as you well know, Karl, Iraq is the setting for what many would say is an Iran versus U.S. showdown, right? So at this time, to then have the Iraqi public in some ways turn against the U.S. would probably not be a good thing.
No, it wouldn't be, but I don't think Donald Trump's been particularly concerned about Iraqi public opinion. I follow Iraqi public opinion pretty closely, and in the Iraqi media, you'll frequently see Iraqis bring up things like Iraqi oil being threatened by Trump. He's said multiple times that he wants to take Iraq's oil to pay for the U.S. presence there, which obviously inflames Iraqi opinion. He's pardoned people before who've committed crimes in Iraq while in American uniform. So Iraqis are, for one thing, divided about Trump.
Then we bring up the entire conversation about private contractors or even mercenaries, as many people would call them, and their role in such war zones altogether. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, do they have a role? Should they even have a role?
Well, I think they can play a role. They can play a positive role, certainly in protection of bases or in protection of high-value individuals. Contractors can play a role. I think in the case of Iraq, following the invasion, they were given too much leeway in terms of how they could engage, how they could deal with the population. So, contractors with with set rules that are enforced can be a positive influence. They can bring expertise, they can bring experience that can be very useful in a conflict zone. At the same time, when it looks like they can act with impunity, they are a very, very negative aspect of the conflict.
And then, as you said, and I want to go back to that because I remember as well that this case was very controversial at the time. Also, in fact, the first time around, I believe it didn't even actually go through, and there was a lot of obstacles in the path to even getting these convictions as they stood before this pardon. Why do you think that is? I mean, what is the logic there for this? Because if these men did even do this mistakenly, and again, I believe the convictions were mainly just manslaughter anyhow, what's the problem with holding, be it private contractors and or even military serving soldiers to account if they do commit crimes and or quote unquote mistakes in which people are then killed, innocent people are killed?
Well, certainly from my own personal perspective, I think it's absolutely imperative that you hold both soldiers and contractors accountable for their behavior in a war zone. Particularly if you're trying to, just on a utilitarian level, if you're trying to win hearts and minds, having soldiers and contractors abuse the population, it's a very, very bad strategy. But ethically, obviously, you need to keep these people in line. Having said that, trying to get into the mind of people in the United States who see this as much ado about nothing, it's a bit difficult for me, but I think that people here tend to take the side of the contractors and the other war fighters and say, look, Iraq was a very difficult environment at that time. It was difficult to tell friend from foe. And because of that, when you have contractors in a very dangerous environment, you need to understand that these people felt like they were under constant threat. That, in my view, doesn't excuse their behavior in any way, shape, or form. But I think that's the argument that you hear from some people here.
So, I mean, what does this then mean? Is this a precedent then that is set for how contractors, et cetera, may then act in the future? I mean, do you think that this sort of pattern of pardons that Donald Trump has begun, and I believe he's fairly unique in this regard with a number of pardons he's carried out, and you can correct me if I'm wrong in that sense. I know other presidents have pardoned people as well, but it's mostly been used as, I believe, an instrument of mercy in many ways. This seems to be different though, right? So, I mean, that has political implications, not just certainly within the country, but for foreign policy as well?
I guess I'm an optimistic person, and I think that this probably will not set a precedent, will not set a trend. It's hard to imagine other presidents in the United States taking this view towards pardons, particularly pardons of people who a lot of people would view as having engaged in war crimes. That's an extremely controversial thing to do. I've not really seen other presidents come close to that kind of thing. So I think Trump is probably an outlier here. Like I said, that's my hope. But I think it's also unlikely, just based on what we see other politicians in the United States doing and saying about these kinds of things. There's just not a lot of support for pardoning individuals who clearly seem to commit war crimes or other types of major infractions like this.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that, but we sincerely appreciate your time this morning. There was Karl speaking to us this morning from Akron, Ohio, sharing his expertise about this case of where Donald Trump has pardoned these four Blackwater guards or contractors or mercenaries, however you want to term them, who killed 14 civilians in Baghdad in 2007. The case was not easy to fight, was not easy to get these convictions done, but they were carried out, and now Donald Trump has pardoned these men altogether. Iraqis certainly not feeling good about the situation. Are their lives worth nothing or very little in the eyes of the American establishment or Donald Trump or Blackwater or whoever you want to view as seeing these lives as not worth as much as, for example, an American life? I mean, if the roles were reversed and the Iraqi government had pardoned four Iraqis who were responsible for killing Americans. How would that go down with the world and with America? That's, of course, something to think about. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're now going to discuss Israeli politics. Israel is headed for its fourth elections now, which will occur, I believe, in March 2021. There was a whole debate over the state budget that didn't go through then. And according to the deal that had been signed between Netanyahu and Gantz, then essentially this now automatically means elections in the upcoming March. Why is Israel having such a hard time forming what I imagine we can then call a stable government, considering the fact that there's been so much infighting and just political upheaval and chaos? Again, I'm using those terms loosely. Certainly, I don't mean to overstate the situation. There is certainly the context also of Netanyahu's own cases, criminal cases against him, which are still very much working their way through the courts. Is he trying to buy time? Is he trying to seek immunity from those cases? He certainly denies, as one would expect, that he is guilty of any such crime, bribery or otherwise, that he is accused of. Benny Gantz saying that, Netanyahu hasn't lived up to his promises within the deal, both parties blaming each other. But what does this mean overall for Israeli politics? And is there even the context of the Palestinians within this, because that seems to then be an afterthought when we're discussing these sorts of things. But I do want to bring that up at some point in this discussion, if possible. Let's now introduce our panelists who are joining us from around the world. We're joined now by Dr. Melanie Garson, who is a lecturer at the Department of Political Science at the University College London. She's joining us from London. Also joining us from London is Yossi Mekelberg, who is a Senior Consulting Research Fellow of Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House. And joining us from Jerusalem is Abbey, who is a Research Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. Alan, Yossi, and Melanie, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Melanie, let me start with you. Is there any surprise that we're going into the fourth elections? I mean, I think that there was a lot of optimism, wasn't there, going into this unity government?
There is optimism, and optimism is always hard to keep in the face of the numerous challenges that the government has had to face. However, I think at the heart of this is the, as you've already mentioned, the case that's going on. The general view is that Netanyahu has used this opportunity as a way to exploit a loophole that would potentially allow him to hold on to the government through the February beginning of the case, beginning of the evidentiary hearings, and to force this election to challenge and not stand by his obligation to allow Benny Gantz to take on his share of the power sharing arrangement.
What are your thoughts about this? What is the game plan here? Because, to Netanyahu's credit, he really, has stood strong in the face of everything that's been thrown at him.
That's why I think that this government was stillborn. It was formed for one reason only, serving Netanyahu's needs to escape justice, escape his criminal trial for corruption, as you mentioned earlier. So all the maneuvers at the end of the day are about avoiding the trial from taking place, and even if the trial itself takes place, it won't lead to a conviction. But yeah, Netanyahu is the Houdini, is the magician of Israeli politics, and I'm not saying that necessarily in a
All right, we seem to have lost our connection. Yossi, we'll come back to him. Alan, in Jerusalem, what are your thoughts there on the ground? I mean, what are Israelis feeling about this situation? I would think that there is, much like Brexit in the UK, there's just a bit of fatigue about this political upheaval.
Well, Israelis like to practice democracy so much. We are going to keep going at it until we get it right, which is why we're having a fourth election. What has happened is that Netanyahu, who has done some masterful things, whether you like him or not, has done it without public support, without engaging his own government, without engaging his own government partners. And just about everyone who's ever worked with him and who is still in politics in Israel is forming or is the head of a party that swears that its number one agenda item is to get rid of Netanyahu. So he has angered almost the entire political spectrum from his left to his right. And it seems like he may have outsmarted himself this time. But just go back to your first point, I think the only person in Israel who felt that Netanyahu would follow through on his rotation government with Benny Gantz was Benny Gantz himself. And it was quite an open secret that, or belief at least, that everyone believed that Netanyahu would never let that happen. And that is, in fact, what has come about.
All right. So, Melanie, if I may bring this in, there is, of course, this huge context of the Palestinians. And I know that what we're discussing right now is more just Israeli politics. But is there a context, is there a role of the Palestinians in all of this, in the midst of this? Because at least from the outside, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like one of the main issues should be, the entire issue with the Palestinians altogether, because I know with the normalization of ties and all of the above that on a foreign policy front, probably things are looking fairly positive for Israel. But unless this very issue right there isn't solved, then how can we move on with politics in this fashion?
You're completely right that in these dynamics, often the Palestinian question is being forgotten, although it is actually at the heart of who will be in the next leadership. And one of the challenges will be in the, as Alan has pointed out, in the movement that's pointed out to this anything but Netanyahu government, we're seeing a very big shift to choices between right, and how that will impact the Palestinian people. There are still challenges. Whilst there's wider regional optimism, certainly from the normalization agreement, which could have incredibly positive effects for the Palestinians, there is still an issue of the Palestinians bringing a coherent voice to the negotiating table with whoever is in power. Now, not that Israel currently is a leading example in a coherent voice with its internal politics. That is still a question to be had. And there is a very big danger that the Palestinian question sometimes get lost, but I think it is ever present in the Israeli consciousness, irrespective of what seems to be going on the visual.
All right, Yossi, back with us. Yossi, of course, please continue where you left off. And secondly, I wanted to add this on as well. Yossi, is about, again, the Palestinian context. The Palestinians, at least to the effect that I've seen of the statements I've seen, I believe, of just the layman Palestinians, they would like to see Netanyahu gone, certainly. But is it as simple as that? Does it mean that if Netanyahu, for example, hypothetically goes, that things will magically fall into place for the Palestinians?
Yeah, and sorry for loss of connection. But I think the Palestinian issue is not going to play a major role in this election. We are in the middle of pandemic, and probably it's not a good time for Netanyahu to hold the election. As a result, that Israel, as of Sunday, is going to a third lockdown, the first country in the world to go into a third lockdown. So I think there are other issues that are going to dominate, including the issue of Netanyahu's corruption trial. Sadly and wrongly, the Palestinian issue is not playing a huge part in the discourse in Israel, especially with the normalization relations with other parts of the Middle East. There is a sense of triumphalism in Israel that what's the rush to sign an agreement with the Palestinians or even to negotiate with the Palestinians. Of course, in the long term, this is the wrong attitude. But it's hard to see what party, as the left almost is completely disappeared, decimated, who is going to hold the banner of peace process with the Palestinians.
Alan, do you think conversations happening with Palestinian authorities at this point in time? I know that there is, there was the taxes that had been released, I believe, to the Palestinians just recently, and then, cooperation seemingly on a security level, I imagine, are still continuing to an extent. But it seems that that's sort of at a stalemate situation. And again, as I put to Melanie and Yossi, it seems hard, again, looking from the outside, and certainly I'm not on the ground, it seems hard to be able to ignore that situation.
Well, there are always conversations. It just depends on what level and with whom. So there are many grassroots Israeli to Palestinian organizations and conversations underway on a daily basis, hopefully building trust and support for some resolution of the situation down the road. And as you suggested, I think you're right, too, that at certain political, military, financial levels, there are discussions of the apparatchiks in both governments. However, at the top levels, no, there are no conversations underway. Israel doesn't want to speak with Abbas. Abbas doesn't want to speak with Israel. Neither is particularly interested in speaking with Hamas. And so we have at the top level nothing going on. We have a hopefully long-term movement toward better relations built on trust and some understanding of each other's narratives at the grassroots level, but that has nowhere near bubbled up to a political level yet. And during the election campaign we're about to have, there will be some discussion from the right-wing parties on the Palestinian what to do in the West Bank and the territories, but I don't see that as a top issue for the average Israeli.
Melanie, give me the final word before I let the three of you go. Sticking with the Palestinian issue, if I may, for a moment, because I brought this up because I feel like in the current context that we have, right, where even as our other guests have mentioned, it seems that Israel is moving ever more right wing. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, certainly on that point. This is just my observation as an outsider. But doesn't that then just mean that as more time passes by, that even though these peoples are living in such close quarters, in literally terms, that it just means that positions are going to be that much more hardened on both sides, making then any resolution in the long term, near term, middle term that much harder to achieve?
I think you make a really good point with that. I mean, as have already been pointed out, there is a real danger that the centrist left has lost a lot of ground, and it stands to lose a lot of ground in the future of what we're seeing in the upcoming and in the pandemic narrative. Everybody's seeking, if you want, personal security rather than looking at that slightly wider picture. What will happen is as soon as that stabilizes and there will be voices that come out. Now, as Alan pointed out, there is this constant at the grassroots narrative. There are constant connections. Finding that space to trickle up won't probably happen until people are able to resume some level of normal life again, but it is a daily reality and it will be one that will have to be addressed, and it is part of these wider normalization agreements. Hopefully we'll be able to bring in other figures, other leadership figures to help move that dynamic forward. But it will be an ever-present important reality that does need to be resolved. And irrespective of a right government, will have to still be a realistic government.
In fact, take an extra minute from a producer, and I'm going to ask Yossi to give our final word if we can. Yossi, in just under a minute on that same point about hardening of positions, this is certainly an important political reality, isn't it?
It is the difficulty here, and at the end of the day, it's as much as I agree with Alan and Melanie, there is a need for grassroots work and bringing people to work together. Now there is a time for leadership to work together, the Israeli-Palestinians, and I don't think in Israel right now there is a leadership that is interested in a peace process with the Palestinians. The Palestinians themselves are divided, and we have to add probably another factor here is the new administration in Washington, what they are going to do. But under all these circumstances, sadly, I think Israel will be more inclined to deal with the issue of Netanyahu, how to form the next government, because it's still there are underlying issues of divisions within the Israeli political system that are not going to change in this election.
Very well. We will leave it there at that, but we sincerely appreciate Yossi, Melanie, and Alan for taking their time out of their busy schedules to speak to us today here in Scope. Melanie speaking to us from London, as well as Yossi, and Alan was speaking to us there from Jerusalem. We appreciate certainly their expertise. The Israeli politics, it's interesting, and I believe there was a graph somebody had put up on Twitter about the kinds of elections that Israel has had recently, and I believe there's been an election every 2 years or so. And Alan had mentioned it's about democracy, but certainly from the Palestinian point of view and others' point of view, and that's a huge context, as our other guests also, all of them in fact, agreed that the Palestinian issue is important and should be part of the conversation, because they're right there, and their human rights and all of the above should be very much part of the conversation of Israeli politics as well, for all people who realize exactly what's happening on the ground. But nevertheless, certainly yes, the pandemic, Netanyahu's corruption cases, all of the above are also important and need to be discussed within that context of Israeli politics also, but with the hardening positions then on both sides, because if Israel is moving that much more right-wing, that just means, doesn't it, again, from my outsider point of view, that hardening positions just makes it that much more impossible or hard for any peace resolution to happen? And can we just base peace resolutions on outsiders, other countries normalizing ties with Israel? That doesn't affect the Palestinians, does it? Because it's not like the Palestinians have been consulted in any of the normalization of these ties, or even in the Middle East peace policy that Donald Trump had come up with. So when exactly do the Palestinians become part of the conversation? That's, again, like I said, an important point, just as an outside observer altogether. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.